Hello, everyone attending StokerCon and the Anne Radcliffe Conference for Academics. My name is TJ Tranchell. I'm pleased to be presenting to you today on some work I've done, which I call the Great American Horror Novel. If you've ever taken an English literature course, especially in the United States, you've probably heard the term Great American Novel. That is a arguable sense which has been going for roughly about almost the entire history of the American novel itself. Really came into vogue about 1850s and then the early 1900s, especially with books like Moby Dick. These are things we consider to be great American novels, regardless of genre. Other things that are considered great American novels include The Wizard of Oz, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, works by Philip Roth, and other things like that, right? Those sort of Western canonical works. In my studies, my academic studies, I have taken that concept, which we'll discuss more, and said to myself, horror can do this too. In many ways, horror novels really are great American novels on their own, in my opinion. And I'm sure many of you share that same opinion. But in looking at it, we have to take into consideration some of these other aspects first of what makes a great American novel, and then combine that with what makes it a horror novel, and then putting these things together into what makes the great American horror novel. Much of the work for the Great American Horror Novel was done by this gentleman, Lawrence Buell. He set some parameters for what makes the Great American Novel, which we will also consider, which include critical reception, influence and inspiration, and adaptability. That third note there, adaptability, I think is one that plays greatest into our look at the Great American Horror Novel, and we will discuss that. We also then have to look at what makes a horror novel. So we're going to look at things that are, in that 40,000 plus word range. So some novellas will come into play here. Longer works such as The Stand and It by Stephen King, which hit the 1,000-page plus mark. What we won't be looking at is short stories, which for much of American horror literature history has been sort of the gold standard. The early horror works from writers in this country included Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Edgar Allan Poe's work in the short story and in poetry, and even most of Lovecraft. Most of the Lovecraft that we read is short stories, despite his influence stretching into other people's novels, such as Brian Lumley's Necroscope and things like that. So what happens then is that there's a large chunk of the inspiration for horror novels that don't actually fall under the Great American Horror Novel category, because they're not novels, they're just short stories. So, what was the first American horror novel? We can pin that down to 1798 and Charles Brockden Brown's Wayland, or A Transformation. Not many people have read this book. You got to get really deep into this topic to even find it. Is it the greatest? No. Was it the first? Yeah. And so that makes it important on its own. Wayland follows the journey of a man trying to find himself, which is common fodder for the novel in itself. Things get horrific and horrifying, and they do certainly set the tone for what we come to expect in a horror novel later. Horror novels in the 18th century the 19th century didn't really take off. We still had mostly short stories. And even the early 20th century, we didn't get a lot of horror novels, as it were. Things like again, Lovecraft short stories, stories of weird tales, things like that. And then we get Robert Bloch's Psycho, which certainly should be considered for the great American horror novel. Critical reception? That's what you might expect for a horror novel, right? Influence and inspiration? Wild. The influence of Robert Bloch stylistically, and of course the subject matter of Psycho, is hard to categorize. There's not much that followed after that couldn't be pinpointed back to it, and so it certainly must be considered. Adaptability? Numerous sequels, not only to the books, but to Alfred Hitchcock's seminal 1960 film, which is still seen as a standard bearer for horror film. And yet some people tend to forget the novel exists. And so that becomes a bit more problematic. There are sequels and rip-offs and pastiches to Psycho. Bloch himself edited a one called Robert Bloch's Psychos, which were short stories in the same vein. And so that influence is phenomenal, right? And that's like the 30s and 40s for horror novels. Like a lot of the pulp stuff of the era tended toward westerns and sci-fi and fantasies and things like that. But we were growing toward it. And that is when we have to consider probably what might end up being our great American horror novel. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. Influential? Absolutely. Critically well received? Definitely. Adaptability? 2 films, one that's better than the other, and a very well received among most viewers, both horror fans and casual viewers, other mainstream viewers, the Netflix series that came out a couple years ago. As far as haunted house stories go, you don't get past Hill House, right? That's it. The first paragraph is cited and quoted in so many works. It would be difficult to count how many, right? And is it scary? Oh yeah, Hill House is scary, right? When we think about that third part, of what makes it horror, and I will go ahead and give my own definition here. What makes it horror then is not necessarily are you scared or is it scary, but rather does it evoke fear or terror? Is fear and terror its primary purpose and subject? So we get lots of subtext, social, political subtext in our horror novels, and that's great, and I love that. But is the primary purpose to evoke fear? Not necessarily to cause fear, but to give you that sense of fear and dread. And Hill House, The Haunting of Hill House, certainly does that. And that brings me to another interesting entry into the possibility of the great American horror novel. And it has to do with purpose. A mystery, for example, or a crime thriller is involved in solving the case or catching the bad guy. And one book and film adaptation, of course, that kind of straddles this line is The Silence of the Lambs. Is it horror? It's a great argument, isn't it? Is The Silence of the Lambs a horror novel? Is the primary purpose to catch the bad guy? I would argue that it's not the primary purpose of that particular novel, as opposed to Red Dragon. It's Thomas Harris's predecessor in that, and the first time that we meet Hannibal Lecter. Red Dragon very much is about trying to catch the bad guy, whereas I think Silence of the Lambs is more about that relationship that develops between Clarice Starling and Dr. Lecter, which is intent on Clarice's trauma. And trauma has a lot to do with fear and terror, right? And so therefore I think the central theme topic, whatever term you'd like to use there, is that it is designed to evoke and discuss fear. What are you afraid of? Clarice is afraid of not being taken seriously, right? Lecter, who we might see as not being afraid of anything, is essentially afraid of being captive for the rest of his life. He wants out of that situation. And so that we have to consider as a horror novel, and definitely one of the best. In going through this entire process, I looked at almost 100 separate novels to narrow down to just a few of what might actually be greats, or even the greatest. And that's really what we're after here, isn't it? Is there one that stands out? There are a wide selection, and what's great is that in the last few years, those possibilities have become even more diverse. So throughout the mid 20th century, we had great female writers like Shirley Jackson and Anne Rice emerge, Kathy Koja later in the century, in the earlier 21st century, and things like that. But things got more diverse, not only beyond white men and white women, but into LGBTQ representation within horror, people of color representation within horror. And I think that is what has made this particular topic more interesting as the books have become more diverse. And I want to talk about just a couple of them now. Some more of the recent works we're looking at come from a wide variety of diversity. And so I mentioned Lovecraft earlier, and Lovecraft is certainly an influential force that we have to reckon with. And so we have Victor LaValle's The Ballad of Black Tom. It's interesting because it is a direct response to Lovecraft. It is taking a person of color into this story and examining that. Is it horror? Oh, absolutely. Critical reception, off the charts. Influence? I think so. Right? Not only was it influenced very directly, but also we can see that it sort of opened the gates to other works that might take on this sort of same approach, in that we can enjoy Lovecraft, we don't have to worship him, and we can express our distaste for some of the more racist aspects of his work, which then of course leads us to Lovecraft Country by Matt Ruff. Matt Ruff is white, and yet this book takes on many of those racist topics in a way that is deep and meaningful, and allows us to see that we can talk about these things, right? We don't have to be so beholden to an influence that we cannot critique it itself. Lovecraft Country, adaptable. Yep, we had that HBO series, which was also very well received. I'm still hoping to see Ballad of Black Tom filmed by somebody. That would be amazing. So sticking with sort of that, also writers, again, who either address or are from the Black community, that's when we get into zombie books. We consider Colson Whitehead's Zone 1. Intent to be a horror novel? That's a little hard to say. Again, if we're looking at it as, is its purpose to evoke fear? Yes, but more in a political manner. And it wears its themes on its sleeve very much. And so maybe that keeps it from rising to that same level of greatness that we would hope to see otherwise. All of this, of course, doesn't happen without Toni Morrison's Beloved. Oh, now there's an interesting choice. Beloved actually crosses over into the conversation of great American novel on its own. Its themes of racism and slavery and motherhood resonate across a greater mainstream audience, as opposed to just being couched in our sort of little niche of the horror novel. So Beloved certainly might actually rise above, because of that mainstream influence, into being not just considered the great American novel, but also the great American horror novel. There are so many things to talk about that we really don't have time to talk about everything, but I want to mention just a couple other things that we can talk about. I discussed LGBTQ presence. I would offer Poppy Zebright's, now Billy Martin's, Lost Souls. Quintessentially American, like we get that southern, not just New Orleans, but North Carolina regionality that does happen to resonate throughout the rest of the country. But regionality becomes a question, like, can it be an American novel but be about one place? Or does it have to be something like The Stand, which does literally cover the entire country? I would argue, of course, that regionality is definitely American, and that we do sort of hide ourselves into our little areas. We have, these New England writers, we have Southern Gothic and things like that. And so Lost Souls is definitely in that Southern tradition, but also in the vampire tradition. And so it does cover a much wider area than we might think. Regionality also places an important part in one of my favorite newer books. And what's great about new books is that we can still include them in this discussion, because this conversation is never going to end. As long as we keep getting new books, there are going to be new books to discuss. And so when it comes to regionality, critical reception, influence, I think it's still building on this one, but Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians, I think, honestly could certainly overtake any of the other books we've discussed as the great American horror novel. While it deals with a definite portion of Americans, these Native Americans in particular, the stories, the characters really can resonate with the greater sense of what is America now. And I think that's very important. When we look at some of these other things, such as The Haunting of Hill House, we could say, well, what was America then? How does it resonate now? And then we could look at The Only Good Indians and say, this is America now. How are we going to read The Only Good Indians 50 years from now? I think we will, and I think it will be something that gets included not just in sort of our horror canon, but also in the greater discussion of American novels and novelists. Jones, of course, is becoming quite prolific, which is great for us, because his work is absolutely amazing and not only discusses these important topics to these Native American characters, but they do go beyond. They're just people. They're Americans, right? They're very recognizable in their struggles and in their personalities, and yet they also have that particular aspect which takes it into just enough of a different territory for those of us like myself, who is the whitest person in the world. We get to see these characters and simultaneously say, wow, look at that unique experience, while also saying, wow, I really resonate with that. I can relate to that. And that's what makes it fantastic. The relational aspects, the fear of not being able to provide for your community or having something taken from that community, I think is particularly valuable now as we continue to experience this pandemic. Like, what's being taken away from us? What are we taking? What do we have to give back? And so that is my 20 minutes. Thank you for listening. If you have any further interest in my own work, I have an author reading as well. Not only do I do the scholarly stuff, but I also write my own fiction, and you can catch that this weekend with your complete StokerCon pass as well. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant weekend.